clear that the line between public goods and private goods is dynamic rather than static. It is not clear on what basis this line ought to be drawn. The fundamental problem is one of resource scarcity. From an economic point of view, it can be argued that the most efficient allocation of scarce resources results in the best allocation of scarce resources. It has been argued recently that we are experiencing the triumph of capitalism globally, and that this is a good thing. But remember David Hume? One cannot derive an ought from an is. Or put another way, just because things are a certain way does not mean that they ought to be that way. The drive for privatization is founded upon at least two values premises. The first is the belief that the private sector can more efficiently allocate scarce resources than can the public sector. The second is that individual rights and personal liberty are more consistent with free market allocations than with command and control distributions. What both of these perspectives overlook are the justice implications of a market economy. While free market principles may well result in increases in aggregate wealth, free market mechanisms cannot be relied upon to ensure this wealth is distributed fairly. The United States provides a prime example. A recent Business Week article noted that wealth is increasingly concentrated in the hands of the wealthy, to the point that currently less than 2% of the citizens in our country control well over half the nation's wealth. It is not only wealth disparity which is at issue. Income varies dramatically between CEOs and line workers, with some CEOs now bringing home in excess of $200 million annually in salary and bonuses. Think about this. Almost $1 million for every workday throughout the year. Such facts do not point to a failure of the free market system, for this system was never designed to deal with problems of distributive justice. Evidence of both wealth as well as income inequality simply suggest that as countries move from centralized to privatized economies, special attention needs to be paid to issues of distributive justice. John Rawls has offered at least two principles for ensuring greater justice in a society. The first principle is that policy decisions ought to be made from behind what he termed a veil of ignorance. Imagine, if you will, two societies, each with identical aggregate wealth. In the first society, the wealth is equally distributed among all members of the society. In the second, one person has all the wealth, and all other members have nothing. In which society would you rather live? Oh, and let me add one thing. If you opt for the second society, you will be the one person who holds all the wealth. The point is obvious. For very many people, once we know who we are in a given society, we make choices which are consistent with our self-interest. As an American faculty member with excellent health care largely underwritten by my university, I may be little concerned personally with debate over a national health care plan. But if I make decisions from behind a veil of ignorance, that is, without regard to my current circumstances, I might feel very differently. If I had an equal chance of being a university professor or an indigent street beggar, I might be more supportive of universal health coverage. This principle has obvious application to business enterprise. If job assignments were made by lottery, and I'm not suggesting they ought to be, and I had a better chance of being a line worker than a corporate executive, what healthcare package would I want my company to offer? A second justice principle for which Rawls advocates suggests we ought not take actions which make the least advantaged members of society worse off than they currently are. This may seem an obvious point, but consider that in a free market economy, the rich tend to get richer, and the poor tend to get, if not poorer, at least no better off. The greatest good for the greatest number may be achieved through a system of free market allocation of goods and services, but there is little to ensure that minority interests are given adequate attention. Rawls suggests that public policies or business practices which tend to make the worst off in a society even worse off are simply unethical, even when such policies or practices lead to aggregate good. Lest you think this is an obvious point, hardly worth mentioning, let me read you a passage from a 1998 publication entitled American Business Values with International Perspectives, authored by Gerald Kavanaugh. In a section entitled Corporations Exploit Other Countries, Kavanaugh suggests, much criticism of free enterprise has been directed against the influence of capitalism in poor countries. When people praise the achievements of free enterprise, they point to the overall affluence of Japan, Western Europe, and the United States, and the political democracy which accompanies it. But in Latin America, Asia, and other parts of the world, free enterprise often accompanies desperate poverty for the majority, right-wing rule, corruption, and exploitation by foreign companies. For example, in El Salvador, free enterprise means 2% of the population own 60% of the land, and 8% receive half of all personal income. The remaining 92% of the population live in poverty, and 3/4 of the children suffer from malnutrition. Yet efforts at reform have been crushed by right-wing death squads, often trained in and by the United States. Critics argue that capitalist countries want to maintain the status quo in developing countries in order to exploit them. Exploitation has profit as its motive. Less developed countries of the world provide natural resources and cheap labor, which make investment very profitable if the political regimes are favorable. Economic development has brought some jobs and income for the poor, and also huge financial rewards to the wealthy elite in Brazil, Colombia, Indonesia, India, and other developing countries. Many of you know better than I whether or not Kavanaugh's perspective is accurate. If it is, Rawls' notion of not making the least advantaged members of society worse off than they already are would imply that there is an ethical problem with the operation of capitalist economies within developing countries. The beauty of the capitalist model is supposed to be that all are made better off. It is often claimed in this regard that a rising tide raises all ships. To the extent this is not true, and the least advantaged are exploited rather than benefited, both business managers and public policymakers would do well to heed Rawls' admonition to guard carefully the interests of the disenfranchised. In this regard, let me close by briefly outlining an American-based initiative which represents a new social contract between business and third world laborers. It is known as SA 8000, with the SA standing for Social Accountability. The program is sponsored by the Council on Economic Priorities, based in New York. SA 8000 is a voluntary standard relating to at least 8 workplace issues, those being child labor, forced labor, health and safety, freedom of association and right to collective bargaining, discrimination, disciplinary practices, working hours, and compensation. Specific definitions are provided within the standard so that there is no ambiguity over, for example, just what is meant by the term child. The Council on Economic Priorities is currently training staff from independent auditing firms in the SA 8000 certification process. Come June of this year, companies may apply for SA 8000 certification from the Council. Accredited independent auditing firms will then be retained to certify the petitioner to SA 8000 standards. Companies adopting the SA 8000 standard hope that this commitment will provide a competitive advantage in the marketplace once consumers become aware of the certification process. From a social justice perspective, certification to the SA 8000 standards would do much to alleviate the negative social consequences which accompany the operation of a free market economy in a developing country. We live under a variety of social contracts, and the companies and governmental agencies we manage are parties to these social contracts. Many of these social contracts are ambiguous and informal, allowing for abuse of individual rights, especially the rights of those who hold little power in our society. We need to carefully consider the justice implications of our managerial actions, whether these be in the area of policy formulation or implementation. Formalizing our social commitments, whether through adherence to written standards such as SA 8000 or through other mechanisms which both protect and empower workers and communities, will allow us to achieve our goals of wealth creation without the unintended consequences of violating ethical principles in the process. Having consistent organizational ethics generates trust, and trust is the basis for organizational success and leadership in the areas of business, government, and education. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dunn. Let us continue with the second question and answer session. Our first question is from Mexico. It's from la Universidad Tecnológica de Nezahualcóyotl, en el Estado de México.
Good morning and congratulations to all of you. How can we get the commitment based on an ethical behavior from a work group that in an organization or a corporation?
Dr. Dunn?
Well, I think the way we begin to get an ethical commitment is to start with something that was referred to earlier, which is a set of shared values. There is in most organizations, at least in the United States, an effort to come up with codes of conduct. Those are usually done in a bottom-up kind of approach where you try to craft consensus around a set of values. And as Mr. Emery pointed out earlier, it's not as difficult as one might think to accomplish that. Once you have a set of shared values, then you can institutionalize that using reward systems that were referred to earlier to reward ethical behavior. After all, if you want people to behave ethically, you will reward that behavior. So I think that's the process that might be suggested here.
Our next question is from Brazil, from Volkswagen do Brasil in the city of Sao Paulo, I believe it's in English.
No question from Brazil? Brazil?
Why don't we come back to Brazil? Let's take another question while we're trying to get Brazil. This one will be from Mexico, from la cervecería Cuauhtémoc Moctezuma SADCB, Navojoa, Sonora, México.
Muy buenos días.
Good morning.
La pregunta
Our question has to do with leadership and probably does apply to personal ethics. Is it true that the leaders are not born, that they're made? But it is also true that the leaders begin to become leaders while they're children, and they continue to grow depending on their environment, their family, and their other relations, and these relations play an important role in his development. What activities would you recommend to establish better foundation to create a better leader?
Mr. Emery, that was part of your theme.
Well, and I think it falls into Dr. Dunn's area. I believe that how we educate our children is hugely important. In a world where more and more focus is on technology and skill-based education, I think we need to see a recognition of and a return to classical values.
Dr. Dunn?
Yeah, I would certainly mirror that perspective as well. The classical values that we are promoting here might be those of teamwork and collectivism, much more evident in other parts of the world than they are in the United States, actually. So I think we should move on.
Thank you. We're next going to try to establish contact again with Brazil, with Volkswagen do Brasil in the city and state of Sao Paulo.
Okay, Mr. Dunn,
Yes.
we'd like to know how the world will deal with ethics inside of the companies, well managed but not well led, as Mr. Emery said.
So how will companies deal with ethics inside the organization that are well managed but not well led? Maybe the first step is to adopt a more leadership perspective. The question was asked earlier about the difference between leadership and management. And from an ethical point of view, I think one of the fundamental differences is how we view our employees. Are they merely resources to be managed? That's the management perspective. Or do we have a nobler vision for what it means to be a human person, which is the leadership perspective? I think fundamentally you have to have that change in ethical orientation so that people aren't merely like land or like capital, resources to be used. That's the starting point.
That's wonderful.
Thank you. And now we have a second question from Guayaquil in Ecuador, from la Universidad de Espíritu Santo.
Can you make a moral decision when the moral of society in which we are inserted has been already so affected by corruption?
Dr. Dunn?
Well, I wish I had an easy answer to that question. When you're dealing with societies that are corrupt, and by corrupt, you may be referring to the bribery example that I used throughout the segment that you just saw. You really have to think carefully about how to restructure that society. And it goes back to a fundamental question about whether people are already fairly compensated, for example. Corruption is rampant in some societies simply because public officials aren't adequately compensated. And then the private sector is relied upon to, in some measure, make up for that compensation difference. It's a catch-22 in the sense that you need economic development in order to create a growing economy, but you need to do that at the same time without engaging in further corruption. So I wish I had an easy answer to that question. I don't.
And now we have a question from Mexico, from El Colegio de Bachilleres, Estado de Sinaloa, in the city of Los Mochis, state of Sinaloa.
Buenos días. Nuestra pregunta es,
Good morning. Our question is, based on Dr. Stewart Emery's presentation, how do you reward the team through empowerment? Is that a reward? Is empowerment a reward for the team?
Dr. Emery? Mr. Emery?
It can be. Obviously, if a team is very effective, then a leader, manager would want to give them more demanding projects and greater opportunities for participation. Other forms of rewards are recognition and acknowledgement, where there are team awards, so everybody on the team gets an individual award for being part of that team. That's another way to do it. Where there are team bonuses and then the teams themselves split the bonus amongst themselves. There's lots of ways of doing that.
Our next question is from Panama. It's from la Universidad Tecnológica de Panamá, Centro Regional Colón.
Sí, muy buenos días. Para ser un líder auténtico, además de las cualidades claramente
Apart from the qualities that we've already mentioned, is it necessary to have a very high degree of charisma? Do you think this is a quality that you bring when you're born? The charismatic leader, is that a born one, an innate leader?
Mr. Emery, do we need charisma to be leaders?
No, it's sometimes a huge handicap because people with charisma are often not required, because of their charisma, to develop strong positions around values. So, in fact, we've seen great charisma be a deterrent to developing true leadership qualities.
Our next question is from the state of Pennsylvania in the United States of America. It's from the Murta Educational Center, University of Pittsburgh at Johnstown, Pennsylvania.
Hello. My question is, are there any general rules that leaders can follow to provide ethical and profitable leadership?
Dr. Dunn?
Well, I like the question in that it asks about both ethical and profitable leadership. The first indication in this question is that these two are not mutually exclusive, that you can both be ethical and profitable at the same time. And we have many examples of companies doing both. As far as the principles or the processes that one might go through, again, in developing codes of conduct, codes of ethics, I think that there's a good leader can institute a bottom-up approach which is participative, which involves workers, which is empowering, which models the very values that you want to come out in that code of conduct eventually anyway. So the processes work together.
Thank you. Now, I think this will be our last question. We may get two more, but let's try. This one's from Mexico. It's from the Instituto Tecnológico de Tlalnepantla, in el Estado de Mexico.
Buenos días.
Good morning.
En el Tecnológico de Tlalnepantla.
In our institution, engineer Alberto Gomez is greeting you now, and we have the following question from him. When we talk about the cultural profile, the ideal one for the leader, in a 100% distribution, how much would you allocate to all these three styles, constructive, the aggressive, defensive, and the passive? How would you distribute this in percentages?
Mr. Emery, can you assign
Señor Emery, ¿puede usted asignar?
So, practically, if we look at the very best organizations, about 80% of the qualities are distributed in the constructive traits, and about 10%, 15% are distributed in each of the other two categories.
Thank you. We're going to take one last quick call. This is going to be from Mexico, la Universidad de Monterrey, San Pedro Garza in Nuevo León, Mexico.
Mi pregunta es la siguiente.
The question is the following. Without an ethics code in an organization, can you have an effective leadership role and model? Thank you.
Well, if we want short answers, I think the short answer is no.
Yes.
I don't think you can have an effective leadership program without having some kind of an ethics program in place. It may not have to be an explicit code, but again, I argue for formalizing that aspect of the social contract and making it explicit so that you can easily have general agreement and consensus around what those ethical rules ought to be.
Mr. Emery, one last word. You agree with that?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Thank you for your excellent questions, but we've run out of time. Thank you again, Mr. Emery, Dr. Dunn. We hope that you've enjoyed participating in this video conference. And thanks to all of our associates for their enthusiastic participation. The International Training Center will continue transmitting programs on topics crucial to improve our productivity and global competitiveness. We invite you to participate on June 4, 1998, in the 6th program of our 1998 series entitled The Emerging Interactive Society, Networks, Internet, and the World Wide Web. For additional information on the International Training Center's programs for this year, please consult your participant's manual, where you will find the dates and specific topics for each program. Also, if you are interested in participating in training programs that will be offered by the International Training Center, please contact the Center by letter, phone, or fax. On behalf of all of us who collaborate with the International Training Center, I thank you for your participation and interest in today's program. See you again soon.